the show, where we share the stories of the many who intersect with our healthcare system but are rarely heard from. My name is Kevin Poe, founder and editor of KevinMD. Rate and review the show at kevinmd.com/rate. Subscribe at kevinmd.com/follow. Today in the show, we have Jessica Reeves. She is a nurse practitioner. Her KevinMD article is titled Florence Nightingale, Clara Barton, Radonda Vaught. Jessica, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So we'll get into your article in a little bit. First off, briefly share your story and journey to where you are today.
Yeah. So I'm a nurse practitioner, and nurse practitioner is actually a second career for me. Before becoming a nurse practitioner, I worked in the nonprofit space, performing arts stuff for about 10 years, 15 years altogether with nonprofit stuff. So shifted over to the healthcare piece and became a nurse practitioner, working primarily primary care, family medicine, and always have had interest in kind of keeping several plates spinning. And so that's one thing that I very much like about my current career, where it stands right now, is that I'm able to scratch a few different professional itches, so to speak.
And we've been talking offline a little bit about your practice, and it is a micro practice, which is a little bit different from a lot of typical primary care practices. So tell us more about that.
Yeah. So I did the corporate medicine thing, seeing 18 patients a day and charting and doing all the runaround and the kind of, I don't want to say hamster on a wheel, but that's how it felt. And I did that, been there, done that, and didn't quite get to the point of burnout, but I could see it on the horizon. And realized that nonprofit piece that I brought with me, where you're always understaffed, but you're doing it for the right reasons. And you're always stretched a little thin, but you're doing it for the right reasons. And it's to serve the mission and to serve the common good, or whatever the particulars are. And really wanting to get back to that and wanting to be a little less of this, the things that I have to do and more of the things that I want to do, and being able to develop longitudinal relationships with patients instead of feeling very transactional. That was important to me. And feeling like I didn't have to see a certain number of patients to reach the overhead, which in a big practice, you have a lot of support, but somebody has to pay those bills. And that comes from the revenue generated from visits. So by doing an intentionally low volume, low overhead practice, it's more work in some ways, right? Because I'm doing everything myself, but it's more gratifying because I'm able to spend time with patients and really dig into the co-production of healthcare, which is important to me. That's not impossible in a corporate medicine setting and seeing a high volume of patients, but it's for me much, much harder. So I feel that my satisfaction has increased. The amount of work I do is probably the same, but it's shifted and I'm much more in the driver's seat. And for me, that was important. And yeah, and it has also opened me to other opportunities. So I was able to write a piece that you ran earlier this summer, thank you. I don't know that I would have had the bandwidth to do that if I was just full-time on that wheel. So that has been a nice thing too. Work-life balance, we talk about that a lot, but I feel like I'm edging closer to that in this setting.
I'm a primary care physician myself, and I always want to encourage more of my clinician listeners to go into primary care. So I think that you've found a setting where you've rediscovered some of that joy in primary care. Now, tell me, how difficult was it for you to start a micro practice? And if someone were, for instance, wanting to switch to a practice like yours, tell us about some of the challenges that you faced in doing that.
I think the biggest challenge was, I don't want to say confidence. You have to have a certain clinical confidence and a certain just willing to fly without a net. I work on that every day, and it's nice to get a steady paycheck. I could definitely say that my bank account was a lot happier when I was working in a 9-to-5 environment, but there were trade-offs. And for me, those weren't worth it. So that was a big piece, was really just digging deep and really thinking about what was important to me and what was going to work for me in the long term. There were definitely things about working in a high volume setting that was beneficial for me. You definitely ramp up that clinical experience very quickly, right? But you get to a certain point where that trade-off starts to happen and you really start to think, is this sustainable? For some people it is. Some people will do that for their entire career and retire and be happy about it. That's not me. And realizing that's what was true, being true to myself, and then finding a way to make it work for me. So if this isn't working for me in this high volume kind of corporate setting, then what would work for me? What do I really want and what's important to me? And then having the support systems. I have a very supportive spouse, I'm fortunate in that way, but having supportive friends, having that confidence and having the skill set, having come to medicine, to being a nurse practitioner as a second career, Before that, I had been in nonprofit management for a long time. So knowing that kind of administrative piece and feeling confident there helped, but you can learn that. So even if it's someone whose experience has been exclusively clinical, there are definitely resources out there. There are tons of groups on Facebook. There are tons of courses that you can take. There's books that you can read. But at some point, you just have to rip that Band-Aid off and fly. Sink or swim. But I think more people will swim than they think. A lot of people think they're going to sink, and no, not necessarily.
All right, let's transition into the piece that you wrote this past summer on KevinMD titled Florence Nightingale, Clara Barton, Radonda Vaught. Now, for those who aren't familiar with Radonda Vaught's story, just give us a little bit of the background, and then you could lead into your article.
Sure. So what happened with Radonda is something that has happened to most people, right, that are working in some sort of clinical setting. At some point, you're going to make a mistake. She made a very unfortunate mistake, and the patient ended up passing because of it. But she made this mistake and did the things that you're supposed to do when you do make a mistake. She reported it to her employer. They did their investigation, and other pertinent parties were brought in to be a part of that investigation. What's different about her case, and what I think is goosebumps even to think about it, so really frightening, is the fact that she was brought up on criminal charges because of this negligence. And her employer was investigated as part of this because of the nature of the error. She gave a wrong medication. She pulled a wrong medication out of a Pyxis machine or similar, ended up giving a medication that caused the patient to die. And it was found that while she was the person responsible for delivering that wrong medication, there were a lot of contextual, cultural issues within the organization that were factors as well. And the employer, which was Vanderbilt Health System, was investigated by their pertinent authorities and were found to have some really serious issues. They were able to settle out of court. They were able to.
Now, what were some of those issues? You mentioned that there were some contextual issues surrounding that case on part of the employer. What were some examples of some of those issues?
Yeah, so there had been some upgrades to their Pyxis, and I'm not sure if it's actually Pyxis, but it was the locked medicine cabinet. There were some issues there. They had been upgrading it. They're assuming they use Epic or similar. So every time you go to pull this medication, you get this error message. Here's the workaround for that. And the workaround in this case ended up costing a patient their life. Yes, much more convenient in terms of being on time, being efficient, delivering the medication, keeping the wheels moving, but at a really extreme cost. And as the Department of Health and Human Services investigated Vanderbilt, they found that there were some serious issues that were putting patient safety in jeopardy, and in this case, the patient's life. They presumably have corrected those, but they weren't brought up on criminal charges. Radonda was. The individual who definitely had a share of responsibility was really made the scapegoat for something that was not exclusively her fault.
And when you heard about this case and you heard that Radonda was brought up on criminal charges, what was going through your mind? Why was it so scary?
Yeah. Who's next? Who's next was the first thing. This could happen to anyone with access to a Pyxis machine, anyone with access to patients, anyone who is overworked, understaffed. This is an issue. This happened before the pandemic. Things have gotten even more intense and even worse in terms of staffing and shortages and just the volume of patient care that's happening at the bedside and in the clinic. And who's next? Those were some of the first things that I thought of. And what sort of precedent does this set for the profession, for the industry? And this is a really slippery slope. I also think of the potential loss of institutional knowledge, right? This is scaring nurses out of practice, is the bottom line. We've also had nurses who are burning out. They're leaving the bedside, they're leaving the profession entirely. The pandemic has exacerbated that. This is another major, significant chip in that armor. And that we'll have new nurses that'll come along, but that loss of experienced nurses, of institutional knowledge that goes with these nurses who are maybe taking an early retirement, that's scary. And in my title, where I talk about Florence Nightingale, Clara Barton, and Radonda Vaught, Florence Nightingale, Clara Barton were these huge figureheads, positively. Maybe not at the time. Florence Nightingale was not necessarily accepted on the first try. But no, looking back, we realized she had this huge impact, obviously, on nursing. I fear that the same will be true of Radonda, and that she will have this impact. Her case will have this impact on nursing for years and possibly generations. I think this is something we'll look back on in the future and say, that was this inflection point.
Now, you have a connection with that nursing world at being a nurse practitioner. Have you talked to some nurses about how that case has affected what they do or changed what they did on a job?
Yeah, I'm finding that a lot of nurses can relate to this case. They've either experienced something, and maybe not to the extreme, but where they've pulled the wrong medicine, or they've had to do a workaround that, oh, wait a minute, looking back, that was really probably a pretty dangerous situation. So nurses can relate to this. Nurses can either, if they haven't experienced it directly, they've known someone else who has, or they can see the potential. But at the same time, we're being stretched so thin. And it's this, maybe that initial spark that starts the wildfire potentially. And I think that's some of the thinking for the nurses who do want to talk about it. And some nurses just don't even feel comfortable to talk about it. They want to just get through the day, and that's as far as they can see, and that's understandable too. These are really tough times to be in any kind of patient-facing role. It's a very challenging time, but things like this definitely don't bring us together. And to think about the context, she was practicing in an environment where she was being really asked to do some things that ended up being really harmful. That's something that a lot of nurses can relate to as well. And to think of that then with the pandemic on top of it, we're very used to advocating for our patients and for keeping the patient's best interests in mind. And that's important, and that should not change. But who's advocating for us? And I say that for any patient facing profession, not exclusively nursing, but that's the lens that I see it through. Who's advocating for us, and who's making sure that the situation we're operating in is safe, professionally safe, personally safe? Workplace violence is a huge issue for nurses. There's so many examples that can be given, but the examples of the advocacy that we have for ourselves, for each other, I think are much fewer. And that concerns me as well. I think there's really a need for us to advocate for ourselves and for one another as strongly as we do for our patients.
Now, does criminalizing medical error, does that actually improve patient safety in your opinion?
I don't think so. I think that the biggest thing in this case, and using Radonda as the example, that really improved patient safety was her surrendering of her license and stopping practicing. Is this going to happen again? Yes. And no one is necessarily thinking of potential criminal charges when they make a mistake, because no one's intentionally making a mistake. So it's called a mistake. So I don't think that criminalizing it, I don't know who that satisfies. I don't know whose situation that improves, really. Maybe the folks who are bringing charges, or family in this case. But I don't think that's the solution. I think the solution is really to be looking at the upstream factors. What led to this mistake being made? Was she simply a nurse who made a mistake, or were there some other factors too that deserve to be addressed, deserve to be acknowledged, and held as much to account as Radonda was?
So just to be clear, after Radonda made that mistake, did she do anything wrong or anything that could have been different in the aftermath?
I don't believe so. I think that the thing that I would advise, or that I would do myself in that situation, is to report it, which she did, and to follow the code of ethics, the state statutes as she's in Tennessee. But it's going to be a surrender of a license. And that's what happened. She reported it, she didn't deny it, she was forthright and she was transparent. From her perspective and the things that were within her control, I think that she did everything correctly. Could other things have been done differently? Looking back, hindsight, of course, is always 2020. Could other things have been done differently? Yes. But in her case, I think that she did what we're trained to do. If you do something wrong, you have to own up to it and accept the outcome. But I don't know that we've ever been trained to think that criminal charges could be a part of that outcome.
We're talking to Jessica Reeves. She's a nurse practitioner. Her KevinMD article is titled Florence Nightingale, Clara Barton, Radonda Vaught. Jessica, you mentioned one thing earlier, is that we in healthcare, nurses, clinicians, everyone involved in the healthcare spectrum, we need to better advocate for ourselves. So what are some of your ideas in which we can do that?
It's surprisingly not a super popular idea, and I don't think it's a perfect idea, but I think that the concept of unions has been something that's been the most effective in the past for other professions in similar situations who don't have that advocacy and don't have that agency. I don't know how often physicians and nurses will compare themselves to Amazon workers, Starbucks workers, but I think in a lot of ways there are some similarities to be analyzed, at least between the two. We don't have, in private practice, maybe different, but if you are working for an employer, you don't necessarily have the level of agency that you might think. And who is looking out for your own professional interests? Is it the employer? I think that's a tough question to answer. If there's a third party, such as a union, that can represent proactively or earlier in the chain of events, I think that has the capacity to benefit a lot. And I think that's something that should be, and I hope will be, a growing conversation within the profession.
And my final question, what are some of your take-home messages that you want to leave with the KevinMD audience?
I think advocacy really is the biggest thing, because it's drilled into us so much to advocate for our patients, as we should. That's our job. But you can't do it at your own expense. Don't be a hero. And you need to, like the oxygen mask analogy, right? You can't save somebody else. You have to put your own oxygen mask on first when the plane is going down. And I think that for too long, and in these very complex times, we're not putting our own oxygen masks on first. And that's what my analogy for advocacy. I think we need to look at that and look for opportunities for that. And I don't think it's going to change with one big movement. I think it's small incremental changes over time and broad-based where we see those improvements, or where we have the potential to see those improvements. So I hope that those in the field, those practicing, anyone facing a patient, can find ways to support one another and to support yourselves, so that you can put your own oxygen mask on and advocate for yourself, so that you can continue to advocate for your patients.
Jessica, thank you so much for sharing your time and insight. Thanks again for being on the show.
Thank you.